What if I told you that the most powerful men in American history had secrets so strange, so surprisingly human, that no history teacher ever dared put them on a curriculum? That behind the portraits and the podiums and the carefully worded speeches, these presidents were waking up at bizarre hours, eating the same meal every single day, talking to their pets like old friends, and following rituals so odd they'd make you question everything you thought you knew about the people running the most powerful nation on earth? You probably assume you know the presidents, the dates, the wars, the famous quotes, maybe a cherry tree story that almost certainly didn't happen. But here's the thing: the daily habits, the private routines, the peculiar obsessions that shape their decisions and their characters, those details were never in the textbook. They were buried in diaries, tucked inside letters, whispered about by staff who worked inside those walls. Every single thing you're about to hear is drawn from historical records, first-hand accounts, biographies, and documented sources. These aren't myths. They're the quiet, strange, fascinating truths about the men who held the nuclear codes and still had to figure out what to eat for breakfast. So before we get into it, do me a favor, hit that subscribe button. Give this video a like because the algorithm doesn't exactly prioritize presidential bedtime habits, and I need your help getting these stories in front of people who actually want to hear them. Now get comfortable. Turn the lights down low. Let tonight be the kind of night where history doesn't feel like homework. Because we're about to go behind closed doors, past the guards, past the press, and into the real daily lives of the presidents of the United States. All 100 secrets of them, starting with the very first. 1. George Washington's dawn writing routine. Before the letters were opened, before the staff arrived, before the weight of running a new nation formally settled onto his shoulders, George Washington was already in the saddle. Every morning at dawn, he mounted his horse and rode out to inspect his farms at Mount Vernon. This wasn't leisure. This was discipline made physical. He believed a man who didn't understand his land, didn't understand anything. The fields were his laboratory, the rides were his thinking time. While the rest of the founding generation was still asleep, Washington was already working, moving, watching. Some men wrote their philosophy. Washington wrote his. 2. John Adams's cold morning walks. John Adams was convinced that walking would save his life, and honestly, given that he lived to 90, he may have had a point. Every morning, often before anyone else in the household stirred, Adams laced up and walked. Long distances, brisk pace. Cold weather didn't stop him. Rain didn't stop him. He scheduled these walks the same way other men scheduled meetings, as non-negotiable. He wrote about them in his diary with the same seriousness he applied to matters of state. To Adams, a body in motion was a mind in motion. He wasn't just walking for his health. He was walking to think. 3. Thomas Jefferson's standing desk. Thomas Jefferson didn't sit and write, he stood. Jefferson designed and used a tall writing desk that kept him upright while he drafted the letters, notes, and documents that filled his days. He was a compulsive correspondent, sometimes writing several thousand letters a year, and he did most of that work on his feet. Whether this was a philosophical choice or simply what made his body comfortable, historians still debate. But the image of Jefferson hunched over a chair doesn't match the record. The man who wrote that all men are created equal apparently preferred to do it while standing up. 4. James Madison's note-taking habit. James Madison never let a conversation die without capturing something from it. He carried the habit of observation everywhere, jotting down ideas, recording remarks, preserving details that other men let drift away. It was the same instinct that produced his meticulous notes from the Constitutional Convention, the closest thing we have to a transcript of the document that built the country. For Madison, no exchange was too ordinary to yield something useful. He treated everyday conversation the way a scientist treats an experiment. Nothing was wasted. Everything was potential material. 5. James Monroe's early office hours. James Monroe believed that public service was a serious obligation and that serious obligations required early hours. He reportedly began administrative work well before most of his contemporaries arrived, reflecting the older Republican ideal that a man in power owed the people his best and most disciplined effort. There was nothing flashy about Monroe's routine, no grand gestures, no theatrical habits. Just a man at his desk, doing the work, before the day gave him any excuse not to. It was a philosophy as much as a schedule, and it shaped everything about how he governed. 6. John Quincy Adams's Potomac Swims. John Quincy Adams swam in the Potomac River at dawn, and he did it regularly, and he did it without fanfare, and he did it well into his 60s. He would rise early, walk to the river, strip down, and swim. This was not a symbolic gesture. This was just how the man started his day. Adams believed in physical rigor the same way he believed in intellectual rigor, completely and without apology. There's a famous story that a reporter once sat on his clothes until he agreed to an interview. Whether or not that's entirely accurate, the swims themselves are documented. The president was in the water before most people were out of bed. 7. Andrew Jackson's battlefield breakfast simplicity. Andrew Jackson ate like a man who expected the bugle to sound at any moment. Breakfast for him was usually plain and fast. Coffee, maybe some toast or cornbread, occasionally a bit of ham if it was at hand. Years of eating in muddy camps and half-ruined farmhouses had trained him to distrust elaborate meals. He didn't linger over flavor, he lingered over readiness. Staff might be fussing over correspondence. Visitors might be waiting in the parlor. But Jackson approached the table like a field mess. Get in, eat just enough, get out. Luxury, to him, was time saved, not butter added. 8. Martin Van Buren's meticulous grooming. Martin Van Buren started his day in front of the mirror, and people noticed. The carefully arranged hair, the precisely tied cravat, the immaculate coats that seemed to reject dust on principle, these weren't accidents. Van Buren believed appearance was part of politics, part of persuasion, part of the daily performance of power. In an era when some presidents still looked like farmers dragged reluctantly into formality, he looked like a polished statesman by design. Opponents mocked him as dandyish, too refined, too concerned with clothes. But every polished button, every brushed sleeve, sent the same message: control starts with the self. 9. William Henry Harrison's early rising soldier habits. William Henry Harrison carried the frontier barracks into the presidential bedroom. He rose before dawn as if roll call were still waiting outside the tent. The habit came from a life spent among soldiers, where daylight was a resource you didn't waste and sleeping late could get you killed. Even in high office, he kept that same stripped-down schedule. Simple breakfast, early meetings, no patience for drawn-out ceremony when the sun was up and work could be done. He tried to run the presidency like a campaign field headquarters. Up early, plans laid out, day spent executing them. The weather, unfortunately, didn't cooperate. 10. John Tyler's long family meal times. John Tyler, by contrast, organized his days around the dining table more than the cabinet room. With a large household and, eventually, a famously large number of children, mealtime stretched. Breakfast and dinner weren't quick refueling stops. They were extended gatherings where conversation flowed, relatives drifted in and out, and politics often took a back seat to domestic life. Tyler could pivot from treaty discussions to disputes over school lessons without leaving his chair. For him, the presidency coexisted with family noise and clinking dishes, not apart from it. Where some presidents fled to solitude to think, Tyler thought in the middle of his own crowded table. 11. James K. Polk's relentless workday. James K. Polk ran his life like a ledger he refused to leave unbalanced. He rose early, went straight to work, and did not stop. Breakfast was brief, if it happened at all. Social events were obligations, not pleasures. Evenings that other presidents used for conversation or music, Polk filled with paperwork and strategy. He'd promised to serve one term and accomplish specific goals, and he approached that promise like a contract he was terrified of breaching. The result was a schedule that squeezed out almost everything but labor. Friends worried about his health. Polk kept working. When his term ended, so did the body that had sustained that pace. 12. Zachary Taylor's informal dress around the grounds. Zachary Taylor never quite took the plantation yard out of his wardrobe. Around the White House grounds, he often dressed like a farmer checking fences rather than a president receiving envoys. Loose trousers, simple coats, sometimes a bit of dust still clinging from a walk. This was his default state. Visitors expecting polished grandeur sometimes failed to recognize the casually dressed man strolling past them as the commander-in-chief. Taylor didn't care. Years in uniform and in the field had made him suspicious of ornament. If clothes kept him warm and let him move, they were good enough. Respect, in his view, was earned in action, not pressed into fabric. 13. Millard Fillmore's structured reading time. Millard Fillmore treated reading like a job with office hours. Every day, usually at the same quiet stretch of late morning or evening, he set aside time for documents, not for novels. Reports from distant consuls, trade statistics, obscure legal opinions, petitions from citizens who would never meet him. He read them, underlined them, stacked them in careful piles. He didn't trust summaries if he could get to the source. Staff might drift in with questions and find him half buried in paper, glasses low on his nose, methodically working his way through the government's printed bloodstream. He believed that a president who stopped reading would slowly lose the country's pulse. So he built his schedule around those hours, retreating into print to reassure himself he still knew what, exactly, he was supposed to be governing. 14. Franklin Pierce's quiet evening withdrawals. Franklin Pierce's days were public, but his evenings tried very hard not to be. After the receptions, the obligatory handshakes, and the practiced smiles, he drifted steadily towards smaller and quieter rooms. A book, a glass, a low conversation with one or two trusted companions, that was his preferred night shift. He had the temperament of someone who absorbed noise like a sponge and then needed hours alone to wring it out. Staff members learned that once the clock passed a certain point, you didn't bring him new problems unless something was on fire. Pierce could be charming in crowds when he had to be, but his real rhythm was interior, long stretches of private reflection, replaying conversations in his head, trying to make sense of a job that demanded extroversion from a fundamentally inward man. 15. James Buchanan's formal hosting schedule. James Buchanan turned the White House into something like a diplomatic boarding house with strict hours. As a lifelong bachelor, he poured the structure most men reserve for family life into social ritual. Receptions were not occasional flourishes. They were routine, almost mechanical. Certain evenings meant certain categories of guests, and he kept that pattern with a bookkeeper's discipline. Foreign ministers knew when they would be summoned. Local politicians knew which night was theirs, and Washington society came to rely on Buchanan's predictability. Invitations, calling cards, seating arrangements, menus. He monitored them with quiet obsession, convinced that regular hospitality could soothe political fractures better than fiery speeches. To him, social order was a form of governance. If you could keep the drawing rooms running on schedule, maybe the Union would remember how to do the same. 16. Abraham Lincoln's late-night storytelling. Abraham Lincoln's workdays often ended long after midnight, but the last hours were rarely filled with memos. They were filled with stories. When tension in the war room climbed too high, or a meeting sank into sour silence, he reached for a memory, a frontier joke, a lawyer's anecdote from an Illinois courtroom. He used humor the way a surgeon uses a scalpel, precisely, sometimes painfully. A funny tale might soften an opponent or gently humiliate a stubborn general, or buy an exhausted cabinet a few moments to breathe. Staff would watch him lean back, eyes half closed, as if he were listening to the story himself as it unspooled. The habit wasn't just performance. It was how he processed grief, fear, and doubt, turning them into parables and letting the room laugh instead of collapse. 17. Andrew Johnson's tailor's precision. Andrew Johnson never entirely left the tailor's bench behind. Years spent measuring bodies and cutting cloth had trained his eye to catch every wrinkle and misaligned seam. As president, he carried that craftsman's attention into his daily routine. He fussed over his own clothes more than some of his predecessors, checking how a coat sat on his shoulders, adjusting a cuff, reteeing a cravat until it lay just so. But the habit went deeper than vanity. He approached paperwork the same way, line by line, phrase by phrase, looking for unevenness, for anything that didn't quite fit. Johnson believed that if you paid attention to small errors, you might prevent larger tears. Staff sometimes mistook this for pettiness. In his mind, he was still doing what he'd always done, trying to make rough material presentable in a world that judged by the finished cut. 18. Ulysses S. Grant's cigar habit. Ulysses S. Grant's days were marked, almost literally, in ash. The cigar in his hand became as constant as his military bearing, a small burning metronome that kept time through meetings, briefings, and long stretches of silent thought. People sent him cigars by the hundreds, then thousands, until the White House seemed to attract them like a warehouse. He smoked while he read reports, while he listened more than he spoke, while visitors searched his steady, unreadable face for clues. The habit had begun on battlefields, where nerves needed something to do and victory brought gifts. In office, it was less about bravado than rhythm. Inhale, consider, exhale, decide. The smoke wrapped him in a moving curtain, softening the edges of a presidency, trying to stitch a broken country back together. 19. Rutherford B. Hayes's diary discipline. Rutherford B. Hayes handled his days twice, first by living them, then by reconstructing them in ink. Long after the last visitor left and the building quieted, he opened his diary like a second office. He did not jot impressions, he built miniature archives. Who arrived when, what they asked for, what he answered, which letters crossed his desk, which rumors drifted through Washington's salons. He tried to catch it all before sleep could blur the edges. The entries could be dry, even plodding, but the point was accuracy, not entertainment. Hayes believed that memory, especially in politics, lied easily. Paper lied less, so he turned reflection into a nightly habit, revisiting decisions as if he were his own historian, asking whether today's choice would look foolish when reread in some future year. The cumulative effect was a president who went to bed not just tired, but cross-examined by his own handwriting. 20. James A. Garfield's multitasking study sessions. James A. Garfield treated his mind like a muscle that should never be caught resting. Even in the tight lattice of a president's schedule, he carved out slices of time that looked more like a student's than a statesman's. Books open on the desk, papers scattered, languages colliding in the margins. Stories circulated that he could write in Greek with one hand while scribbling Latin with the other, or read a text while simultaneously taking notes on a different subject. Whether perfectly true or embellished, they captured something essential about his daily rhythm. Garfield hated intellectual idling. If a meeting ran long, part of his attention drifted to a problem in mathematics or a phrase in a foreign tongue he'd been turning over. Staff might find him in a rare quiet moment, eyes distant, fingers unconsciously sketching letters on the blotter, already halfway back into some private lesson he'd assigned himself. 21. Chester A. Arthur's midnight work hours. Chester A. Arthur's presidency ran on a different clock from most of the country. Morning, for him, was a rumor. His day truly began when other people's were winding down. After the last formal dinner, after the guests with respectable bedtimes had departed, Arthur settled into a nocturnal groove. He reviewed documents under gaslight, dictated letters to tired secretaries, and weighed patronage appointments while the city outside dimmed to a murmur. Tailors and barbers had visited earlier. By midnight, the polished exterior was complete, and he could finally turn to decisions without worrying who was watching. He liked the quiet, the way problems seemed smaller when the corridors were empty. Telegrams could still arrive, but fewer people demanded instantaneous answers. In those hours, time felt elongated, elastic, as if a man could stretch one night into 3. The penalty came in sluggish mornings, but Arthur accepted that trade, better rested thoughts than rested gossip. 22. Grover Cleveland's solitary fishing escapes. Grover Cleveland had a blunt, almost stubborn idea of rest. It was not parties, not elaborate vacations, but simply getting away from voices that wanted something. Fishing gave him that. When schedules allowed, he disappeared to water with a small circle, or when he could manage it, alone. The ritual was not romantic in the storybook sense. His gear was practical, his clothes unremarkable, his manner steady. What mattered was the silence between casts, the way the line arsed out and drew his attention with it. On shore, his life was a constant barrage of petitions and crises. On a boat or at a riverbank, there were only choices of bait and patience. Not everyone approved of a president vanishing with a rod when headlines were loud. Cleveland considered the criticism irrelevant. If a few hours of still water kept his temper and judgment intact, the country was getting the better end of the bargain. 23. Benjamin Harrison's electric light curiosity. Benjamin Harrison walked into a White House stepping quietly into the modern age, and the wiring made him uneasy. Electric lights were a marvel and a menace in the same glance, brighter evenings, but also invisible currents running through the walls of a house that had never been built for them. Stories from the time suggest that Harrison and his family hesitated to touch the switches themselves, preferring that staff do the actual flipping. It wasn't simple superstition. The technology was new, the safety uncertain, the occasional spark a reminder that progress sometimes arrived with teeth. Yet Harrison was not a reflexive opponent of innovation. He watched the system, asked questions, learned its quirks. Each night's illumination was a small, ongoing negotiation with change, embracing convenience while half expecting the experiment to misbehave. In a way, his cautious dance with the light switches mirrored his broader presidency, caught between old habits and the accelerating machinery of a new century. 24. William McKinley's carnation in the lapel. William McKinley's public image narrowed, over time, to a few repeated details, and one of them was a flower. A simple red carnation, anchored in his lapel most days, became less an accessory than a daily ritual. He pinned it on like a quiet piece of armor before stepping into meetings, receptions, or the endless tide of office seekers. The habit had personal roots tied to a friend, a bit of sentiment, a preference for that particular bloom, but it gradually took on a public life. Visitors noticed, asked about it, sometimes left with the flower itself as an impromptu keepsake when McKinley handed it over. The gesture turned the carnation into a moving token of favor and warmth. In the machinery of late 19th century politics, where so much felt calculated and mechanical, this small living detail offered a repeatable comfort, something bright, fragile, and easily replaced, pinned close to the heart each morning. 25. Theodore Roosevelt's boxing breaks. Theodore Roosevelt believed that stillness bred softness, and softness in a president was a kind of dereliction. His schedule looked like a siege. Visitors, memos, hearings, arguments about trusts and railroads, all stacked so tightly that lesser men might have clung to the desk and never left it. Roosevelt did the opposite. In the middle of the workday, he would abruptly carve out time for what he called vigorous exercise, which often meant stepping into a private room, shrugging off the trappings of office, and putting on gloves. Boxing was not a hobby he saved for weekends. It was a shock treatment, a way to reset his own system when decisions started to blur together. An aide could be taking dictation 1 hour and watching the president trade blows the next, sweat darkening the mat while the problems of state briefly shrank to the distance between two fists. He boxed hard enough, long enough, that a blow in one of these sparring matches eventually damaged his eye. He kept that mostly quiet and kept exercising anyway. To Roosevelt, the risk of injury was less alarming than the risk of becoming sedentary in a job that invited it. The bruises faded, the habit remained, a daily reminder that the presidency, like a fight, demanded energy you could not summon from paperwork alone. 26. William Howard Taft's morning golf habit. William Howard Taft did not fit the emerging Rooseveltian ideal of the rugged, charging executive, at least not in silhouette. Newspapers loved to mention his size. They were less interested in the one quiet way he tried to keep himself moving. Taft took to golf as both exercise and escape, and for him the day's rhythm often tilted toward the morning round. While Washington yawned awake and clerks shuffled into their offices, Taft was sometimes already out on damp grass, working through holes with a small circle of companions. Golf was gentler than Roosevelt's boxing, but the habit served a similar purpose. A stretch of time when the demands of the presidency had to wait for a swing, a walk, a search for a ball in the rough. The game also nudged golf itself closer to the center of American public life. A president with clubs in his hands made the sport look respectable, even aspirational, to a growing middle class waking up to leisure culture. Critics saw frivolity in a chief executive chasing a ball while tariffs and trusts needed attention. Taft saw a way to start the day with moving lungs, cleared thoughts, and conversations that unfolded at the pace of walking, not telegraphs. By the time he came back to the White House, shoes streaked with grass, he had already logged miles before the first appointment appeared. 27. Woodrow Wilson's daily motor drives. Woodrow Wilson's presidency unfolded at the edge of two eras, horse-drawn politics fading into the roar of combustion engines. He chose the engine. For Wilson, the daily automobile drive became a fixture, a scheduled retreat hidden in plain sight. It was called recreation, and it was. But it was also a controlled environment he could step into when the pressure inside the White House walls grew tight. The route might loop through the Capitol's boulevards, past monuments still settling into their own meanings, or out toward quieter stretches where fields and trees replaced brick. Wilson sat in the back seat, hat set, body rocked gently by the car's motion as the driver did the work. Sometimes he talked with his companions. Sometimes he simply watched the scenery unspool, using the forward motion as a mental rinse. The drives were regular enough that staff folded them into the day's architecture. Meetings had to bend around that moving hour when the president was technically accessible, but also at a remove, no longer trapped behind a desk that anchored every request. Critics who preferred the older style of president on horseback might have sniffed at the modern indulgence. Yet those daily circuits in the motorcar were an early mechanical version of what later eras would call downtime, deliberately staged distance between the office and the man who carried it. 28. Warren G. Harding's poker evenings. Warren G. Harding's public reputation hardened, over time, around words like Teapot Dome and scandal, but his nights held a more intimate ritual long before the headlines crashed down. Poker, for Harding, was both relaxation and social glue. After formal events dimmed and the official visitors left, a different kind of guest drifted in. Friends, political allies, sometimes men with business before the government, all ready to sit at a felt-lined table where cigars and stories circulated as freely as chips. These card games could run late, the hours marked by the shuffle of decks and the clink of glasses, rather than by legislative clocks. Harding liked the camaraderie, the easy joking, the illusion that here, at least everyone at the table played under the same rules. The line between leisure and politics, however, never stayed sharp. Relationships cemented over hands of cards had a way of resurfacing in appointments, favors, and decisions. Money was not always the most valuable thing at stake. In a town where access was its own currency, an invitation to the president's poker night carried weight. To Harding himself, these evenings likely felt like a retreat, a return to the small-town newspaper office climate he'd once known, only with more powerful men and higher ceilings. To history, they look like another example of how private relaxation, when conducted in political company, never really leaves the realm of governance. 29. Calvin Coolidge's long morning sleep. Calvin Coolidge moved through public life with an economy of words that earned him the nickname Silent Cal, but his most consistent daily statement involved neither speeches nor signatures. It involved staying in bed. Coolidge was famous, even in his own day, for sleeping long and often. Where other presidents rose before dawn to show their vigor, Coolidge slipped free of that contest. He could sleep 10, 11 hours at night and still find room in the schedule for an afternoon nap. Staff learned to build their expectations around the fact that the president would not necessarily be at his most reachable before mid-morning. His defenders pointed out that he worked efficiently in the hours he did claim, that a rested mind made fewer impulsive decisions in a decade when the country seemed content to hum along without constant executive interference. Detractors saw indolence, a man dozing while underlying economic strains pulsed unseen. Coolidge himself appeared unbothered by either interpretation. He took doctors' advice about rest seriously, especially after personal losses and bouts of illness thinned his own reserves. In the quiet of his room, shades drawn, the noise of Washington dulled to a faint background hum, he pursued a different kind of presidential stamina, less theatrical, more private, measured in unbroken hours under a quilt, rather than steps marched across a stage. 30. Herbert Hoover's medicine ball ritual. Herbert Hoover's public image, scarred by breadlines and bank failures, does not easily accommodate the picture of a man grinning under a flying medicine ball. Yet before the Great Depression defined him, Hoover's mornings at the White House often began with something closer to a group sport than a briefing. On the South Lawn, as the sun burned the dew off the grass, Hoover and a rotating team of aides and officials formed a loose circle. The ritual was simple: a heavy medicine ball, thrown high and hard, players shoving for position to grab it, twist, and hurl it back into motion. They called it Hoover Ball, half-jokingly a hybrid of volleyball and calisthenics. For the president, it was an answer to the sedentary trap of governance, a way to get lungs open and muscles awake before the incoming tide of memoranda. The game was competitive but controlled. Positions in the circle did not always align with positions in the cabinet. Hierarchy blurred when a well-aimed throw knocked someone off balance, and laughter briefly overruled protocol. There was symbolism in that, whether intended or not, a leader choosing to collide physically with subordinates before sitting down to direct them by pen. As economic storms gathered, the image of Hoover hurling a medicine ball might have looked incongruous, even jarring, to observers who wanted agony reflected at every hour. But inside the fence line, for those morning minutes, it was simply a habit, a brisk, pounding reminder that the body carrying the weight of the presidency needed conditioning of its own. 31. Franklin D. Roosevelt's cocktail hour. Franklin D. Roosevelt ran a wartime presidency that often looked, on paper, like an endless emergency. Telegrams from fronts, cables from allies, economic briefings, intelligence summaries. Problems arrived faster than any human could comfortably process them. FDR's response was to build a small island into the middle of his day and defend it with near religious regularity. The pre-dinner cocktail hour at the White House was not optional decoration, it was ritual. At a set time, the president would close the door on staff discussions and shift into host mode. Drinks were simple, sometimes famously questionable mixtures he cheerfully pushed on guests. The real rule was conversational. War talk was discouraged. Policy arguments were banned. Guests were expected to bring gossip, jokes, stories, anything that shook loose the constant stiffness of crisis. Roosevelt used the hour to read people at ease, to take the temperature of morale without minutes being recorded. For those who joined, it felt like a domestic pause. For him, it was daily psychological armor, mixed and poured before dinner. 32. Harry S. Truman's sunrise walks. Harry S. Truman inherited decisions that would scar the century. Atomic bombs, the Cold War's early lines, the question of how much power a modern president should casually wield. Yet his own beginnings each day were almost aggressively ordinary. Truman was a walker. He rose early, often before most of the White House fully woke, and headed out at a brisk pace that surprised younger aides trying to keep up. The route changed around the White House grounds, through Washington streets, down to the mall, but the purpose stayed constant. Walking cleared his head in a way no briefing book could. He swung his arms, kept his shoulders set, and used the rhythm of his steps to turn over problems silently before they were spoken aloud in meetings. Passers-by might see only a slight man in glasses and a hat moving quickly through the chill, nodding politely. What they did not see was the small private negotiation happening in those miles, the attempt to steady himself physically before facing another day of choices that could not be walked back. 33. Dwight D. Eisenhower's daily painting sessions. Dwight D. Eisenhower spent most of his earlier adult life in environments where hesitation was punished and orders traveled down steel chains. By the time he reached the presidency, he carried decades of military habit, the weight of D-Day, and the expectations that a five-star general would run the government like a campaign. His inner life needed somewhere quieter to go. Eisenhower found it, improbably, in paint. He was not a prodigy, not even especially gifted by professional standards, but he approached his canvases with the same structured discipline he once brought to war rooms. When spare pockets of time appeared, often in the evening or on lighter days, he would set up his easel and lose himself in landscapes and portraits. The process was slow, forgiving in a way military schedules and congressional calendars never were. Mistakes could be painted over, not buried with consequences. Aides might walk in on the president in shirt sleeves, brush in hand, face softened into concentration that had nothing to do with alliances or appropriations. The act of painting itself, more than the finished works, became a daily valve, releasing pressure without speeches, without briefings, only strokes. 34. John F. Kennedy's swimming and stretching. John F. Kennedy projected ease, a young tanned president photographed on sailboats and at Hyannis Port, seemingly immune to stiffness or fatigue. Beneath that performance was a spine that hurt almost constantly, injuries and surgeries that left him dependent on braces and medications. His most necessary daily habit was not glamour, it was therapy. Kennedy's doctors prescribed swimming and specific stretching routines to keep his back from locking under the grind of travel and meetings. The White House pool transformed into something closer to a private clinic. Each day, often in the afternoon, he would slip into the water for laps, movements that freed his body from gravity's constant grind. Afterward came floor exercises and stretches that looked, to an outsider, like ordinary calisthenics, but were in fact carefully calibrated survival techniques. Staff scheduled around this block of time because they understood the trade, missed the therapy, and the pain might sideline him in more visible ways. JFK's glamorous image of athleticism was, in practice, a quiet, repetitive effort to keep agony just slightly behind him. 35. Lyndon B. Johnson's poolside persuasion. Lyndon B. Johnson did not believe in wasted minutes, and he especially did not believe in wasted proximity to power. For him, relaxation was just another room in which deals could be made. The White House pool and, later, the Johnson family pool at their Texas ranch became extensions of the Oval Office. Senators, aides, and visitors would find themselves summoned not to a leather chair but to the water. Johnson, often already submerged or sitting at the edge, used the informal setting to soften resistance. A man in a swimsuit, towel on his shoulder, cigar in hand, did not look like the architect of sweeping legislation, but that was the trap. LBJ would cajole, flatter, corner, and sometimes literally block the steps until a wavering vote edged his way. Laughter, drinks, splashing, these were part of the staging, making the conversation seem casual as commitments quietly hardened. For Johnson, the daily swim was never only about cooling off. It was about reshaping the atmosphere so that pressure felt like hospitality and saying no felt awkwardly out of place. 36. Richard Nixon's solitary late-night work. Richard Nixon's presidency is remembered for microphones, missing minutes, and the feeling of a man increasingly alone in a building full of people. His daily rhythm fed that solitude. Nixon tended to retreat into long, late-night work sessions after much of the staff had gone home, when the West Wing hallways thinned and the hum of the day dropped to a low mechanical murmur. In those hours, he surrounded himself with memos, briefing books and foreign policy cables, reading, underlining, and dictating thoughts into a recorder. The night insulated him from immediate pushback. There were no faces across the table, no reporters in the briefing room, just paper and his own voice captured on tape. Decisions could be rehearsed, resentments articulated, strategies shaped in the relative safety of darkness. Aides would arrive in the morning to find fresh stacks of directives and notes waiting, products of hours they had not seen. What felt to Nixon like control, quiet, uninterrupted analysis, also deepened the gulf between his inner world and the daylight presidency that still had to answer to others. 37. Gerald Ford's skiing and athletic routine. Gerald Ford entered the presidency with a reputation that would later be flattened into a late-night punchline about clumsiness. In reality, he had been a serious athlete long before he was a politician, a star football player at the University of Michigan who turned down offers from the NFL. That early identity never left him. Inside the White House, he clung to daily physical activity as if it were a lifeline to something more grounded than ceremonial speeches and economic crises. Mornings or late afternoons might find him working through calisthenics, golf practice, or swimming laps, carving exercise into days already packed with briefings. On vacations, he hunted for snow. Skiing became both a form of escape and a quiet assertion that he could still move under his own power, away from scripted events. Staff worried about injuries, photos of him tumbling on slopes, the optics of a president wiping out. Ford saw something else, the reassuring burn of muscles that still did what he told them. One daily realm where gravity and balance answered directly to him, not to polls or party leaders. 38. Jimmy Carter's scheduling precision. Jimmy Carter had trained as a naval officer and nuclear engineer before politics, and he brought that same tightly coiled precision into the Oval Office. To him, time was not an abstract background. It was a resource to be measured, allocated, and protected from waste. His days in the White House were sliced into carefully defined blocks, meetings stacked with almost unforgiving efficiency. Briefings had start and end times that were expected to mean something. Staff who tried to pad the calendar with vague windows of flexibility learned quickly that Carter would notice and push back. He read his own briefing books, often in dense detail, and expected the day's schedule to reflect that preparation. No small talk, no ceremonial filler stretching beyond what was absolutely necessary. The effect on the building was immediate. The West Wing took on the tempo of an operating room, instruments laid out, procedures planned minute by minute. Critics later said he micromanaged, sinking into details beneath a president's pay grade. But for Carter, each precisely timed day was an ethical stance. If you asked the country for 4 years of its patience, you did not waste minutes as if they were infinite. 39. Ronald Reagan's afternoon nap. Ronald Reagan's public image was built around clarity and confidence, a former actor who could deliver a line, hold a room, and project ease under lights that wilted other people. Offstage, his daily rhythm acknowledged something more basic: stamina is finite. In the White House, Reagan often carved out a regular afternoon period to lie down and shut his eyes, a short nap that staff quietly protected in the daily schedule. To some critics, it became a symbol of disengagement, an older man drifting off while complex policy debates raged outside his door. But those inside the operation understood it as part of his energy management system. Reagan believed that being fully present at key moments, negotiations with Congress, meetings with foreign leaders, televised addresses, required arriving with a reservoir that had not already been drained dry by endless, unfocused hours. The nap was not framed as indulgence, it was maintenance. Afterward, he often returned to meetings with the same genial patience that had charmed voters, his mind clearer for decisions that would be replayed again and again on the evening news. In a town that glorified exhaustion, he quietly insisted on the radical act of lying down. 40. George H. W. Bush's morning jogging. George H. W. Bush came from a world of prep schools, World War II combat, CIA briefings, and diplomatic cables, but his mornings often began in running shoes. Jogging was not a midlife novelty for him. It was a habit he carried through his years in public service, a moving ritual that stitched together continuity as his titles changed. At the White House, dawn runs became a daily signal that the president was already in motion before many staffers had reached their desks. Secret Service agents trotted alongside, sometimes huffing to keep pace with a man who had been an athlete before they were out of school. The run served more than cardiovascular health. Bush used the time to talk informally with whoever was on the route that day, a roving, sweat-soaked staff meeting where questions could be raised without the formality of a situation room. Photographers loved the image, a fit president pounding pavement. Age and health eventually nudged him from jogging toward other forms of exercise, but the imprint remained. For Bush, the discipline of placing one foot in front of the other, again and again at sunrise, was its own quiet briefing on his body, his limits, and the fact that no matter yesterday's triumphs or embarrassments, today's distance still had to be covered. 41. Bill Clinton's late-night reading and music. Bill Clinton's presidency often felt like it existed in 2 time zones. There were the official hours, meetings, ceremonies, photo opportunities, and then there was the long, elastic stretch of night when the building dimmed and he refused to. Clinton was a voracious reader, not just of official memos, but of policy reports, history, biographies, and whatever else landed on his desk. Late at night, when many staff had gone home and phone lines quieted, he would settle in with stacks of material, highlighters and margin notes marking his trail through dense pages. Music threaded through these hours. Jazz, rock, classical playlists became a backdrop as he read, thought, and sometimes pulled in aids for impromptu discussions that stretched past what most people considered a reasonable bedtime. The combination created a strange, almost collegiate atmosphere inside parts of the White House. A president up late cramming for the next test, soundtrack humming, mental gears still turning long after the official schedule had ended. Supporters saw an endlessly curious mind refusing to turn off. Critics saw a chaotic work style that blurred rest and labor until neither was effective. For Clinton, the late-night blend of books and music was more personal than strategic. It was the familiar cadence of how his brain had always worked, imported directly into the most powerful house in the country. 42. George W. Bush's pre-dawn wake-ups. George W. Bush turned the time habits of his predecessor almost upside down. Where Clinton's White House glowed deep into the night, Bush's day started before much of Washington had even stirred. Pre-dawn wake-ups were a defining feature of his routine, an anchor around which the rest of the schedule was built. He rose early, sometimes before the first faint light reached the east wing windows, and used those quiet hours to read a devotional, scan intelligence briefings, and frequently exercise. Running, biking, and strength workouts were shoehorned into a morning window that most staffers considered the outer edge of sanity. The rationale was simple and stubborn: if you moved your body early, no crisis that erupted later could take that away. It also shaped the building's culture. Senior aides adjusted their sleep cycles because the president's day was half over by the time some lobbyists had their first coffee. Long, meandering late-night meetings were discouraged. Decisions were pushed into earlier slots. Critics described Bush as rigid, someone who prized structure over nuance. But his pre-dawn starts were less about appearances than control. In a job defined by incoming fire, terrorism alerts, economic shocks, political storms, he claimed the first hours as territory the world could not yet invade. 43. Barack Obama's night owl work pattern. Barack Obama inherited a presidency shaped by both late night and early morning men, and he quietly chose his side of the clock. Even as he made a point of eating dinner with Michelle and the girls most nights, once the family time ended and the residence grew still, his other shift began. Aides knew that after 10 p.m., folders would migrate upstairs, intelligence briefings, policy memos, long analytical pieces he insisted on reading himself, instead of relying solely on filtered summaries. He kept a yellow legal pad close, filling it with small looping notes, questions, and follow-ups that would boomerang back to staff the next morning. Some nights included sports on quietly in the background, or music low enough not to disturb the household, but the core of the routine was solitary work, as if the introvert in him needed hours when no one watched, no cameras waited, and no one knocked with a "Mr. President, you need to see this right now." Critics framed his night owl habit as distant, a president withdrawn into briefing books. Supporters saw discipline, a lawyer's mind ordering chaos on paper. For Obama, the late hours seemed less about theatrics and more about reclaiming a slice of mental space in a job that otherwise left almost none. 44. Donald Trump's limited sleep habit. Donald Trump arrived at the presidency with a carefully cultivated myth that he barely slept and saw it as a competitive advantage. Long before the White House, he told interviewers that 4 or 5 hours a night was plenty, that sleeping more was for people content to be outworked. That narrative followed him into office. Staff described phones buzzing late into the night and early in the morning, tweets fired off before dawn, cable news consumed in stretches that blurred day and night. The official schedule sometimes showed relatively light mornings, but those close to him insisted he had already been awake for hours, watching, calling, reacting. Sleep scientists questioned the sustainability of the pattern. Allies repeated the story as proof of relentless drive. Inside the West Wing, the idea that the president was almost always awake created its own kind of tension, a feeling that no hour was truly off limits, that a single early morning message could reorient an entire day. Whether he consistently slept as little as he claimed is hard to verify from the outside. What is clear is that he wanted the country to picture a president who refused to turn off, equating rest with lost momentum and framing insomnia as a kind of leadership. 45. Joe Biden's Peloton-style fitness focus. Joe Biden entered the presidency as the oldest man ever to hold the office, fully aware that his daily habits would be scrutinized for signs of stamina or decline. One of the quieter threads running through his routine was not a jog on the mall or a heavily photographed bike ride, but indoor cardio more suited to a secure, heavily monitored environment. Reports of him using a Peloton-style stationary bike, or at least a similar setup, raised security debates, wireless connections, built-in cameras, the digital exhaust of a workout in the most surveilled house on earth. The Secret Service and tech staff had to think not just about the president's heart rate, but about data streams, hacking risks, and what it meant for a world leader to pedal in front of an internet-connected screen. For Biden, the appeal was straightforward. A controlled, repeatable workout that fit into a schedule where outside runs or public gyms were unrealistic. A burst of endorphins before long meetings. The steady rhythm of pedaling offered a counterweight to hours of sitting in briefings, a way to keep aging joints moving even when the job confined him to secure rooms and motorcades. The symbolism cut both ways. A modern president on a modern machine, still contending with the ancient problem of how to keep a body functioning under relentless strain. 46. Washington's handwritten letter marathon. George Washington lived in a world without email, phones, or even reliable daily newspapers, which meant that governing the early republic was, in practice, an endurance event of ink and paper. His days in office were chopped into long stretches of correspondence, dictating letters to secretaries, reviewing drafts, adding his own flourishes in a meticulous sloping hand, and then signing his name again and again until it almost detached from meaning. Domestic policy, foreign dispatches, military updates, land disputes, pleas from ordinary citizens, all flowed through his desk. Visitors often found him already seated at a writing table, quill in hand, the presidential body engaged in a task most modern executives delegate far down the chain. Part of it was necessity. Information moved at the speed of horses, so written orders and reassurances were the only way to project authority beyond the Capitol. Part of it was temperament. Washington believed that a president's legitimacy partly rested on demonstrating attention, and in those early years attention looked like personally wrestling words onto parchment. The cumulative effect was a life where vast portions of each day dissolved into sentences, replies, and careful phrasing, a marathon of letters that stitched together a fragile union one signed page at a time. 47. Jefferson's weather log entries. Thomas Jefferson might be remembered for declarations in libraries, but one of his most enduring daily habits was remarkably small, jotting down the weather. Morning and evening, through years of diplomatic postings, presidential duties, and retirement at Monticello, he recorded temperature, wind, precipitation, and sky conditions with a persistence that bordered on obsession. Tiny notebooks filled with numbers and observations, frost on the fields, storms rolling over the mountains, heat settling thick over Virginia summers. To modern eyes, it can look like a charming eccentricity, a founding father doodling about clouds. For Jefferson, it was part of a larger, Enlightenment era faith in data, the idea that careful, repeated measurements could reveal patterns in nature and inform agriculture, architecture, even health. The habit anchored his days, a small scientific ritual bookending whatever political storms he faced. During his presidency, when debates over embargoes, expansion, and slavery weighed heavily, he still paused to note the day's conditions, as if insisting that the physical world be recorded alongside human conflict. Historians and climatologists later mined those logs for insight into early American weather trends. Jefferson likely never imagined that his quiet, daily glances at the sky would outlast so many of the speeches that thundered beneath it. 48. Lincoln's open-door office mornings. Abraham Lincoln's presidency unfolded under the greatest internal crisis in American history, yet his daily mornings often began with something surprisingly informal, an open door. At set times, ordinary citizens could line up and be admitted to the president's office, bringing petitions, complaints, pleas for jobs, or requests for pardons. The scene was less regal audience than crowded waiting room. Farmers next to businessmen, widows next to party operatives, all funneling into a space where the president might be reading dispatches one moment and listening to a personal tragedy the next. The noise, the interruptions, the emotional whiplash would seem unthinkable in a later age of tightly controlled access and carefully curated schedules. But Lincoln treated the ritual as central to his understanding of the job. These encounters were raw data, a direct line to how policies and war orders translated into individual lives. They also exhausted him. Mornings could disappear into a blur of voices, leaving afternoons for cabinet meetings and military strategy. Some aides grumbled that the open-door system was chaotic, that it drained precious time and energy. Lincoln persisted, even as the war intensified. In a capital filled with rumors and abstractions, his daily willingness to sit and listen made the presidency feel, for a few noisy hours, like a very personal office indeed. 49. Polk's no wasted minutes ethic. James K. Polk's presidency came with a self-imposed expiration date and a very specific promise: 1 term, 4 goals, then home. That deadline shaped his days like a metronome. His private diary, written in clipped, matter-of-fact lines, reads less like a statesman's reflections and more like a relentless timesheet. He rose early, worked through breakfast, and stacked meetings so tightly that visitors sometimes cooled their heels in the hallway as he finished dictating letters. Polk famously avoided parties and social chatter, not because they didn't exist in his Washington, but because he saw them as time thieves. Leisure, for him, was not a reward at the end of the day. It was something that other, less serious people indulged in. Where some presidents built personal rituals to decompress, walks, rides, reading, Polk's decompression looked suspiciously like more paperwork. Even Sundays, notionally reserved for rest, filled with quiet reviewing of dispatches and correspondence. The habit gave him a reputation for joyless intensity, but it also explains how a single-term president ended up redrawing the map of North America. He treated each day as a shrinking resource he was morally obligated not to waste. 50. Grant's horse-centered leisure. Ulysses S. Grant is often remembered as the quiet general with a cigar, but his oldest comfort was not tobacco or whiskey, it was horses. From childhood, he had an uncanny ability to calm and handle them, a skill that followed him through West Point, the Civil War, and into the presidency. In a capital where political relaxation usually meant salons, card games, or backroom dinners, Grant's idea of unwinding involved a stable, a saddle, and motion. As president, when the crush of patronage seekers and Reconstruction battles grew heavy, he slipped into a routine that looked almost old-fashioned even then, riding. He would inspect cavalry mounts, test his own animals, or simply take a brisk ride out of the immediate city, letting the physical rhythm of the horse reset his mind. A man criticized for his reserve in conversation seemed most at ease speaking softly to an animal, hand on a neck, checking a hoof. The habit wasn't dramatic or formally scheduled, but it was consistent enough that reporters and foreign visitors noticed. In a town increasingly organized around rail timetables and telegraph wires, the president still carved out pieces of his day for a technology powered by muscle and trust. 51. Hayes's prayerful household rhythm. Rutherford B. Hayes's daily life as president blended Victorian domestic order with a quietly intense sense of moral duty, and nowhere was that more visible than inside the household. The Hayes family ran the White House less like a palace and more like a disciplined parsonage. Regular prayer, scripture reading, and moral conversations punctuated the days, sometimes folding into breakfast, sometimes ending evenings that might otherwise have drifted into late-night politicking. His wife, Lucy Hayes, a committed temperance advocate, reinforced that rhythm. Alcohol vanished from official events, not just as a policy stance but as a household standard. Staff learned quickly that the residents kept particular hours and expectations, children's routines respected, Sunday observances maintained, gossip discouraged. Hayes might move from an argument over Southern policy to a quiet family prayer without framing it as two separate worlds. For him, the spiritual scaffolding of the home stabilized the chaos of the office. Critics mocked the parson in the White House, but the routine gave his days a predictable spine, the presidency outside, a devotional cadence within, both ticking along in parallel, each shaping how he understood the other. 52. Arthur's fashionable evening changes. Chester A. Arthur entered the presidency unexpectedly, but he refused to let the office dull his taste for elegance. If some presidents treated clothing as a mere necessity, Arthur turned it into a daily ritual bordering on performance. He was famous for changing outfits multiple times a day, reserving particular care for evening wear. A typical day could see him in a morning suit for official calls, a different ensemble for afternoon business, and then a meticulously chosen tuxedo or tailcoat for dinner and receptions. These weren't just vanity projects. They were part of how he signaled control to a capital that had initially doubted him. After the chaos of Garfield's assassination, Arthur's methodical attention to dress functioned as a reassuring ritual, precision in the mirror, precision at the desk. Tailors knew his measurements by heart. Visitors commented on the shine of his shoes, the cut of his vests, the gleam of his jewelry. While other presidents sought comfort in reading or exercise, Arthur found it in the predictable sequence of fabrics, layers, and buttons. The changing of clothes became a daily reset button, carving his time into distinct acts: morning administration, afternoon negotiation, evening spectacle. 53. Cleveland's secret surgery recovery schedule. In the summer of 1893, Grover Cleveland's daily routine briefly became a state secret. Facing a dangerous growth in his mouth during a financial crisis, he slipped away for what the public was told was a simple fishing trip on a friend's yacht. In reality, surgeons removed part of his upper jaw and the tumor attached to it, working in near silence as the presidential body floated on the East River. When he returned, his staff faced a strange challenge: adjust his days to accommodate recovery without revealing what had happened. His schedule quietly thinned. Meetings shortened. Long speaking engagements were avoided while he relearned how to talk comfortably with a prosthetic device in his mouth. He read more memos in private, delegated more public appearances, and sometimes arranged visitors so that they sat on his better-looking side. Newspapers speculated about his health, but the inner rhythm of the White House said nothing. It simply bent around his healing. The secrecy meant that a significant portion of his daily life, pain management, careful eating, practice forming words, existed in a hidden layer beneath the published schedule. The president's convalescence became another invisible habit, woven into the fabric of governance and guarded as tightly as any diplomatic cable. 54. McKinley's dependence on typed briefings. William McKinley occupied the presidency at a technological hinge point, and his daily reading habits showed it. Where earlier presidents drowned in handwritten letters and scribbled notes, McKinley embraced the typewriter's clean lines. He preferred orderly, typed summaries of complex issues, turned into neat stacks he could work through systematically. Clerks and secretaries became informal editors, condensing reports, correspondence, and legislative proposals into digestible briefs, double-spaced, legible, organized by subject. His desk, instead of bristling with random papers, often held these compiled packets, which he could annotate in the margins and return with clear instructions. This reliance didn't just save his eyes, it subtly changed how information reached him. People who wanted his attention learned to shape their arguments for a machine-crafted page, knowing that a tangled longhand letter might never rise to the top. The habit also signaled a shift in presidential time management, from the era of solitary letter-writing marathons to an age of mediated, pre-processed data. McKinley still met visitors, still listened to spoken appeals, but the backbone of his day increasingly ran through the clack of keys in nearby rooms, turning the chaos of a modernizing nation into the illusion of orderly lines on paper. 55. Theodore Roosevelt's fast reading spurts. Theodore Roosevelt liked his days crowded, almost overstuffed, and his reading habits matched that restlessness. He didn't read to unwind at the edges of the day so much as wedge books into every unclaimed crack. Mornings could start with official papers but detour, briefly, into a history volume before breakfast, a lull between cabinet meetings. He might plow through a chapter of a naval chronicle. Waiting for a carriage, a train, or a visitor running late meant a few more pages of some obscure natural science text. Roosevelt reportedly devoured a book or more a day when he could, a rate that sounds like legend until you remember how ruthlessly he compressed his time. He read quickly, but not passively, scribbling marginal notes, arguing with authors in his head, mentally filing away anecdotes for future speeches or articles. Staff learned that handing him a document meant getting it back marked, underlined, digested in minutes. He treated reading less as leisure and more as a kind of intellectual calisthenics, fast, dense spurts that kept his mind as perpetually exercised as his famously overworked body. 56. Taft's customized bathtub solution. William Howard Taft's presidency is often reduced unfairly to jokes about his size, but his most infamous household adjustment tells you something quieter about how he approached comfort and dignity. After a humiliating incident in which a standard tub proved inadequate, Taft didn't just laugh it off. He had an enormous custom-made bathtub installed, big enough for multiple men to sit in comfortably, though only one man ever actually used it. The decision was practical. If his daily bath was going to be an ordeal, it might as well be a controlled one. But it also reflected a certain stubborn refusal to let public mockery dictate private routine. Inside that oversized porcelain fortress, the President of the United States could soak without anxiety, read dispatches propped on nearby stands, and start or end his day without the dread of another physical embarrassment. Staff treated the tub with a mix of respect and quiet amusement, but within the rhythm of Taft's mornings and evenings, it became just another piece of presidential infrastructure, a small personal correction to a world not built with his body in mind. 57. Wilson's controlled rest periods. Woodrow Wilson's presidency ended under a cloud of illness and secrecy, but even before his catastrophic stroke, His daily life involved careful management of energy. The public image was of a tireless reformer and war leader, but behind closed doors, aides and, later, his wife Edith became gatekeepers of his exertion. Meetings were stacked, but not always evenly. Stretches of intense work alternated with strictly protected rest periods, when doors stayed closed and interruptions were filtered. After his 1919 stroke, this pattern hardened into a kind of unofficial medical schedule. Access to the president ran through Edith and a small circle of doctors, who decided what documents he saw, what visitors were admitted, and how long he could endure conversation before fatigue blurred his focus. Letters were read to him, decisions coaxed out in short bursts, then followed by enforced quiet. To outsiders, it looked like normal presidential privacy. In reality, Wilson's days became a carefully moderated cycle of exertion and recovery, with his capacity measured in minutes and pages rather than sweeping public appearances. The habit of controlled rest, once a simple health precaution, evolved into a structural feature of his administration. 58. Harding's Porch Conversations, Warren G. Harding is often remembered for scandals that exploded after his death, but his preferred mode of daily political work was surprisingly relaxed and old-fashioned. He liked porches as a senator and then as president. Harding gravitated toward informal, semi-public spaces where conversation felt less like negotiation and more like neighborly talk. At the White House and at his retreat in Marion, Ohio, he hosted visitors on verandas, front steps, and shaded chairs, drifting between policy talk and gossip with an ease that made people underestimate him. He believed, perhaps naively, that many tensions softened if you discussed them seated side by side instead of across a stiff desk. Reporters, party bosses, and local delegations discovered that serious decisions could emerge from these seemingly casual chats, appointments offered, favors promised, compromises floated. The porch routine fit a man who saw himself as a healer of post-war strain, more small-town editor than imperious executive. It also created a daily rhythm where some of the most consequential conversations of his presidency unfolded not in formal cabinet rooms, but in the hazy, unrecorded space of comfortable outdoor chairs and unhurried talk. 59. Coolidge's Bedtime Beauty Products. Calvin Coolidge projected austerity in public, few words, tight budgets, a kind of Yankee chill, but his private bedtime routine included one surprisingly indulgent ritual. He reportedly liked to lie in bed with his hair slathered in petroleum jelly, his head covered in a cap, letting the mixture soak overnight. In an era of dubious beauty advice and homegrown remedies, a Vaseline cap treatment didn't seem as odd as it does now, but it still stood out against his otherwise frugal image. While staff and family moved through evening routines of correspondence and reading, Coolidge might already be in his room, head encased, quietly reading newspapers or drifting into the narrow, early sleep he preferred. The practice hinted at a man more concerned with personal appearance than his taciturn persona suggested, or simply someone who trusted a habit once it formed, no matter how sticky. For a president who famously napped often and retired early, the nightly ritual turned his bed into a strange mix of rest and maintenance, a place where the country's chief executive could momentarily behave like any other anxious middle-aged man trying to keep his hair from thinning. 60. Hoover's efficiency-minded breakfasts. Herbert Hoover approached the presidency like an engineering problem, and his mornings reflected that impulse toward efficiency and control. Breakfast for him wasn't a leisurely affair with sprawling spreads and long conversation. It was a streamlined operation, simple, predictable foods, served at consistent times, arranged so he could eat quickly while reviewing typed briefs or telegrams. An engineer by training, Hoover disliked wasted motion and wasted minutes. He preferred routines that minimized decision fatigue, so the first hour of his day ran almost like a factory line: wake, dress, sit, eat, read, rise. Staff learned that improvisation at breakfast, surprise guests, novelty dishes, extended social chatter tended to throw off the rest of his schedule. In a White House increasingly wired with telephones and buzzers, his morning table became a quiet command post. Papers stacked neatly, coffee precisely timed. The habit didn't make him a better politician, but it did reveal the mindset he brought to a job resistant to neat solutions. While markets crashed and banks failed, the man at the center still tried to carve out at least one part of the day where everything functioned with machine-like regularity, even if the world outside refused to cooperate. 61. FDR's stamp collecting breaks. Franklin Roosevelt spent his days juggling war briefings, economic crises, and political infighting, but tucked into that chaos was a strangely quiet habit: stamps. Not as a casual pastime, but as a structured retreat built right into his schedule. Aides knew there were moments when the flow of memos and visitors would pause so the president could spread out envelopes, tweezers, and albums on his desk or bedside tray. He sorted, mounted, and cataloged, sometimes dictating letters while his hands worked, sometimes lapsing into total, deliberate silence. To outsiders, it seemed quaint, almost childish. To Roosevelt, it was a controlled mental reset that didn't require leaving his wheelchair, the one place where the burdens of war shrank down to perforated edges and canceled marks from distant places. He answered mail from fellow collectors, traded duplicates, and used the hobby to connect with ordinary citizens in a way that felt unthreatening and apolitical. In a life scrutinized from every angle, stamp collecting gave him a tiny, repeatable ritual. 15 minutes here, half an hour there. Where the world's map was reduced to colored rectangles, he could move with his fingers. Instead of armies, he had to move with orders. 62. Truman's piano practice. Harry Truman liked to present himself as a plain-spoken Midwesterner, but his private relationship with music was surprisingly formal and disciplined. Long before he reached the White House, he'd studied piano seriously enough to consider a professional path, and he never quite let that part of himself go. As president, he kept a piano close at hand, and on certain mornings or late evenings, staff could hear him working through pieces with the same methodical persistence he applied to budget briefings. This wasn't casual tinkling of keys for amusement. He practiced scales, repeated difficult passages, and treated his sheet music like another set of documents to master. The habit gave him a framework of order when the day's news was anything but orderly. Between decisions about Korea, labor strikes, and atomic policy, he could sit down, straighten his back, and enter a world where problems resolved, at least on the page, with cadence and harmony. Occasionally he played for guests, joking self-deprecatingly about his skill, but the daily essence of it was private. At the keyboard, Truman wasn't commander-in-chief. He was the boy from Missouri, still trying to get the phrasing right. 63. Eisenhower structured lunch meetings. Dwight Eisenhower came to the White House from a lifetime of military command, and he never stopped thinking in terms of schedules, chains of command, and efficient use of time. Even his lunches became part of that system. For Eisenhower, the midday meal wasn't primarily about food. It was a tactical slot on the daily calendar where relationships could be shaped and problems quietly triaged. He preferred small, carefully chosen groups at the table: an aide, a cabinet member, maybe a legislative ally, rarely a large, chaotic crowd. Conversation moved easily between golf jokes, war stories, and specific policy questions, but the guest list and topics were never accidental. If he wanted to soften a disagreement, float a controversial idea, or size up a subordinate, lunch was ideal. Less formal than the Oval Office, more controlled than a public event. Menus tended towards simple dishes, nothing that distracted from talk or dragged out the meal. In theory, it was a break. In practice, it was another battlefield, just with better china. The habit made him seem relaxed, approachable, while still pushing his agenda in the most unthreatening setting possible, over sandwiches and coffee instead of memos and commands. 64. Kennedy's newspaper saturation. John F. Kennedy's mornings often began not with one newspaper, but with a small stack, each representing a different slice of American media. He didn't just flip headlines, he compared, almost like a student cross-checking sources. The same story is framed by the New York Times, the Washington Post, a local paper, a conservative editorial page. Kennedy scanned them all, mentally charting how each outlet angled the narrative. To him, it wasn't mere curiosity, it was reconnaissance. He wanted to know how his speeches landed, how foreign crises were being explained to the public, how opponents were shaping their arguments. Aides and family members recalled him reading quickly, margins sometimes folded or marked for follow-up, punctuated by abrupt questions. Who leaked this? Why did they bury that detail? Which columnist is pushing this line? The days later briefings would be filtered through this early exposure to public perception. Television mattered, but print still set the agenda, and Kennedy treated his morning newspaper marathon as both thermometer and steering wheel. Before he met with advisors, he had already met the version of reality being sold to millions of readers, and he behaved accordingly. 65. Johnson's early morning phone campaigns. Lyndon Johnson's reputation for relentless persuasion, the famous Johnson treatment, didn't switch on at office hours. It started early, sometimes brutally early, with a telephone receiver pressed to his ear before most of Washington was fully awake. For Johnson, the quiet morning window was prime real estate. Senators at home, lobbyists off guard, staff still soft from sleep. He'd call to check in, to push, to cajole, to remind someone of a favor owed or a vote coming due. These weren't brief, polite conversations. They were rolling performances, part flattery, part intimidation, with Johnson pacing, sometimes in pajamas or robe, mapping alliances before breakfast. The phones in the White House residence and Oval Office became extensions of his will, and his staff learned to have talking points and legislative tallies ready at odd hours, because the president might suddenly decide that 6:30 a.m. was the perfect time to lock down a wavering committee chair. Morning for most people was coffee and news. For Johnson, it was active campaign, conducted from a private perch, where he could press his case without the spectacle of public confrontation, just one-on-one pressure in the quiet hours when people were least prepared to resist. 66. Nixon's bowl of cottage cheese and ketchup. Richard Nixon's public image was careful, guarded, almost painfully controlled, so it's odd that one of the most remembered details of his daily life is a bowl of cottage cheese drowned in ketchup. It wasn't a one-off experiment. It became, by multiple accounts, a recurring snack or light meal he actually liked. In a White House where every movement could be political theater, this particular habit was almost aggressively unglamorous, diet-conscious, bland, and a little unsettling. Nixon, perpetually worried about his weight and appearances, gravitated toward ascetic food choices, and the cottage cheese ritual fit that anxiety, low-fat, filling, stripped of indulgence. The ketchup, whatever else it did, at least added color, and a familiar taste to a dish that otherwise felt like penance. Staff watching him eat it saw a man trying to satisfy hunger while punishing himself for having it, spooning from the bowl with the same inward focus he turned on briefing books and tape transcripts. The odd combination stuck in public memory because it seemed to expose something rawly unpolished about a president obsessed with management and image, a reminder that even at the highest office, people cling to their strangest little comforts. 67. Ford's stair-climbing fitness. Gerald Ford had the build and background of an athlete, and he never quite saw the presidency as an excuse to go soft. His daily life in the White House folded exercise into movement itself, not as a separate, dramatic workout block, but as a constant, low-key choice. When possible, he took stairs instead of elevators, treating each flight as a small, stubborn refusal to let the sedentary rhythm of high office win. Aides grew used to trailing behind him up and down stairwells, briefcases in hand, sometimes a little out of breath, while he kept an easy pace. He also swam regularly, using the pool as a private lane where he could push his body in repetitive, measured strokes that temporarily drowned out political noise. The exercise wasn't about image. Ford knew jokes about his clumsiness would follow him regardless, but about control over one of the few variables he could still manage, his own health. In a job defined by constant sitting, meetings, motorcades, ceremonies, Ford built a quiet countercurrent into his days, one step, one lap at a time, insisting that staying physically strong was as much a duty as reading the day's briefings. 68. Carter's DIY carryover habits. Jimmy Carter entered the White House with calloused hands and an engineer's habit of asking how things actually worked, not just how they were described in memos. That mindset didn't vanish behind the gates. Even as president, he was known to tinker with small repairs, adjust thermostats himself, or dive into technical questions that most leaders would delegate without a second thought. Staff recalled him peering at system diagrams, wanting to understand energy use, wiring, flow, anything that might be made more efficient. On trips home to his farm, he didn't simply pose for photographs among the tools and fields, he picked them up and used them, returning to tasks like checking equipment, planning crop rotations, or literally hammering boards in place. Inside the White House, he approached policy problems with that same hands-on instinct, scribbling detailed notes, working through figures, revisiting drafts until he could trace the logic line by line. It sometimes frustrated advisors who preferred broad strokes and quick decisions, but for Carter, the daily habit of engagement at the nuts and bolts level was a continuation of his old life. The office had changed. The expectations had not. Fix what you can reach and understand what you're responsible for. 69. Reagan's jelly beans at hand. Ronald Reagan's presidency was wrapped in carefully crafted imagery, and one of the smallest but most persistent props on that stage was a jar of jelly beans. The candy was more than a snack. It was a ritual, a tiny, repeatable comfort that sat within arm's reach on desks, tables, and conference surfaces. Reagan had originally picked up the jelly bean habit years earlier as a way to quit pipe smoking, substituting sugar for tobacco, but it followed him all the way into the Oval Office. Cabinet members, journalists, and visitors found themselves casually dipping into the jar during meetings, breaking tension with a handful of color. Staff noticed how Reagan would idly select a few beans while listening, the motion unhurried, almost theatrical, softening the perceived distance between president and guest. The candy jars also turned into a quiet branding exercise. Manufacturers produced special presidential assortments, and the image of Reagan with his jelly beans became a sort of shorthand for his folksy, approachable persona. Beneath the symbolism, it was just a man keeping a familiar treat nearby, returning throughout the day to something sweet and predictable while navigating problems that were anything but. 70. George H. W. Bush's handwritten notes. George H. W. Bush ran a modern presidency with computers, secure communications, and large staff systems, yet he clung to a distinctly old-fashioned daily habit, writing notes by hand. Not just formal letters on heavy stationery, but quick personal messages, thank yous, condolences, congratulations, small acknowledgments that most politicians would leave to aides. He scrawled them in a tidy, slightly compressed script, sometimes late at night, sometimes squeezed between meetings, addressed to world leaders, congressional opponents, staff members, Secret Service agents, or people far from power whose stories had crossed his desk. The point wasn't political leverage so much as maintaining a human thread in a job that could easily turn purely transactional. These notes accumulated in mailboxes and desk drawers across Washington and beyond, forming a quiet paper trail of a man trying to anchor his day-to-day authority in gestures of courtesy. Bush's diaries and phone calls handled the big picture. His pen handled the small. In a world shifting toward email and mass-printed form letters, he kept reaching for stationery, practicing a daily discipline of recognition that outlived his term as recipients later brought those notes out as prize proof that the relationship had once been personal, not just procedural. 71. Clinton's McDonald's jog route lore. Bill Clinton's relationship with exercise arrived wrapped in stories, and few were retold more than his jogs that allegedly detoured through fast food stops. The image of a jogging president veering into a McDonald's became part late-night comedy, part cultural shorthand, and part genuine curiosity about how disciplined or undisciplined his daily routines really were. In reality, Clinton did run, often with staff, Secret Service, and journalists trailing along, using the outings as both cardio and rolling conversation. Occasional food stops, whether for coffee, a snack, or the much-talked-about burgers, blurred the line between fitness and indulgence, feeding a narrative of a president who could discuss policy with economists and then order fries 2 minutes later. Over time, these episodes turned into a kind of folklore, repeated and embellished until it was hard to separate exact fact from amplified legend. But underneath the jokes was a recognizable rhythm, a man trying to squeeze exercise into a schedule that never stopped, willing to let the public see his imperfect mix of health goals and comfort cravings. The daily jogs weren't just about mileage, they were mobile town halls, spontaneous photo ops, and a public admission that even presidents bargained with themselves about food and discipline. 72. George W. Bush's ranch clearing workouts. George W. Bush's presidential image included the trappings of Texas, boots, brush, wide skies, and those weren't just for campaign backdrops. At his Crawford Ranch, physical labor became a deliberate part of his daily routine, especially when he needed to decompress from the intense abstraction of war briefings and policy debates. He cut brush, cleared trails, hauled tools, and worked the land in ways that left sweat stains instead of briefing binders. To critics, The imagery seemed staged, a performance of ruggedness. To those who watched closely over time, it was also a consistent personal pattern. Bush used manual work as both exercise and mental reset, preferring the straightforward logic of clearing a field to the tangled compromises of Washington. The repetitive motions, lifting, dragging, cutting, provided a workout without treadmills or gym mirrors, while the physical effort helped burn off the residual adrenaline of public life. Staff noted that he sometimes returned from these sessions calmer, more settled, ready to re-enter the world of secure calls and classified folders. The ranch wasn't an escape from responsibility so much as a place where one slice of his responsibilities, stewardship of land, care for his own body, could be addressed with gloves, sweat, and a pile of cleared brush as visible proof something had actually been finished. 73. Obama's two-session reading style. Barack Obama's reputation as a reader wasn't just a personality trait, it was wired into how he structured his days. He tended to divide his reading into two distinct sessions that mirrored the split nature of the modern presidency. Mornings were for dense intelligence, the president's daily brief, memos from agencies, threat assessments, all compressed into carefully curated packets that demanded focused, almost clinical attention. That early block of reading anchored him in the concrete realities of the day: security risks, diplomatic signals, economic tremors. Later, usually at night after the formal schedule quieted, he shifted into a different mode with books, long articles, and policy essays that weren't always tied to immediate crises. Novels, history, philosophy, and social science mingled with briefing binders on his bedside table, forming a late-night seminar he conducted for himself. Advisors noted that he often pulled ideas, metaphors, or case studies from this second reading life into discussions days or weeks later, as if his mind had been turning them over in the background. The split habit, tactical facts in the morning, reflective reading at night, let him navigate the constant urgency of the job while still feeding a slower, deeper current of thought that couldn't fit into any daily schedule grid. 74. Trump's TV monitoring habit. Donald Trump's daily information diet broke sharply from the thick binders and private memos that defined earlier presidencies. For him, television wasn't background noise, it was a primary instrument panel. Cable news served as a running scoreboard, focus group, and weather radar for his own public image and the issues swirling around it. He watched multiple networks, flipping between friendly and critical coverage, and paid attention not just to headlines but to tone, graphics, and panel chatter. Advisors learned that what appeared on-screen in the morning could shape the mood and priorities of the afternoon as he reacted to praise, criticism, or breaking stories in real time. Instead of waiting for curated summaries of public opinion, he treated the television as a direct tap into how he believed millions of people were experiencing the presidency. That habit blurred his roles as both consumer and subject of the news. He sometimes live-tweeted his responses, effectively joining the programming as an off-screen participant. To supporters, this showed responsiveness to the public conversation. To critics, it revealed an unhealthy fixation on personal coverage. Either way, the daily reality was simple. The glow of the TV set was as much a part of the White House routine as the morning brief. 75. Biden's train commuter legacy. Joe Biden's long Amtrak commutes between Wilmington and Washington became one of the most enduring rhythms of his public life. For decades in the Senate, the train was not just transportation, but a moving office, living room, and listening post where he read documents, held quiet conversations, and greeted familiar conductors by name. That repetition etched a commuter's logic into his sense of time. Departures and arrivals, regular faces, predictable stations, a daily return home that most national politicians surrendered long ago. Even when the presidency shifted him into motorcades and secure aircraft, that image of the train-riding official still clung to his public identity, symbolizing a kind of working commuter's routine transplanted onto the highest office. The habit left traces in how he approached the job. Stories from those years surfaced constantly in his conversations, and he framed issues in terms of how they landed on people who caught the 6 a.m. train or dragged home after the late one. Staff and allies leaned into the narrative, but it rested on a real pattern: thousands of trips that taught him schedules, delays, and the stubborn insistence on returning to the same platform, day after day, no matter what happened in Washington. 76. Adams's cider and simplicity, breakfast reputation. John Adams came from a world where breakfast was fuel, not performance, and his morning habits reflected that older, austere sensibility. Accounts of his routine often mention hard cider with breakfast, a common drink in colonial New England when water purity was uncertain, and fermented beverages were considered everyday staples rather than indulgences. Alongside the cider, his meals tended toward plain fare: bread, cold meats, simple porridges, less a curated menu than a straightforward start to the day. For Adams, whose diaries reveal a man preoccupied with virtue, discipline, and the dangers of luxury, that simplicity fit his sense of Republican character. A leader of a new republic, in his view, shouldn't begin the day with extravagant spreads that echoed European courts. The modest table was part practicality, part philosophy, a daily reminder that vigor and moderation mattered more than display. Later generations looked back on these habits with a mix of curiosity and moralizing, sometimes exaggerating or romanticizing the role of cider, but the underlying pattern remained consistent. Adams approached mornings as a farmer's son turned lawyer and revolutionary would: quick nourishment, a fortifying drink, and then straight into the day's arguments, correspondence, and duties with little sentimentality about the menu. 77. Jefferson's rotating book stands. Thomas Jefferson built his life around ideas, but he also understood the physical mechanics of thinking. His study was organized less like a museum and more like a workshop, and one of his favorite tools was the rotating book stand, a wooden carousel designed to hold multiple open volumes at once. With a gentle push, he could spin between languages, sources, and subjects without stacking books precariously or constantly standing to fetch another reference. This device, along with specially arranged desks and custom tools, turned reading and writing into a kind of engineered process where efficiency supported curiosity. Jefferson's letters mention working on multiple texts simultaneously, comparing legal codes, scientific treatises, and historical accounts, and the stands let him keep these conversations literally in his field of vision. The habit of surrounding himself with reachable information reflected his broader approach to knowledge. He collected books obsessively, categorized them, and treated them as working instruments rather than distant treasures. When his personal library later seeded the Library of Congress after the British burned Washington, that same practical mindset traveled with it, a belief that access and arrangement matter. His daily life among rotating stands and reachable volumes showed that for him, study wasn't just mental, it was logistical. 78. Monroe's formal dress codes. James Monroe occupied a transitional moment between powdered wigs and a more relaxed American style, but his personal habits leaned firmly toward the old world. As president, he maintained formal standards of dress that would have seemed slightly antiquated even in his own time: carefully chosen coats, precise cravats, and an insistence on presenting himself in a way that echoed earlier revolutionary figures. This wasn't just vanity, it was a daily expression of how he believed the office should appear to the public. Whether he was conducting routine meetings, receiving delegations, or walking across the grounds, he treated his clothing as part of the institution's dignity. Aides and visitors noted that Monroe's formality created a particular atmosphere around even ordinary duties, reinforcing distance and respect in an era when the country was expanding fast and regional manners were diverging. While later presidents experimented with more informal moments of dress and presentation, Monroe's habits held to ceremony, as if his clothes were a thread connecting the fragile new power of the United States to the established traditions of European diplomacy. Each morning's choice of attire became a small ritual of continuity, asserting that however young the nation, the office itself demanded an old-fashioned kind of decorum. 79. Jackson's paperwork aversion. Andrew Jackson's day was shaped less by quiet hours over documents and more by forceful, in-person decision-making. He came out of a military world where orders were given aloud, loyalties tested face-to-face, and problems settled with blunt conversation rather than pages of memoranda. In the White House, that habit never really changed. Jackson relied heavily on secretaries and clerks to digest, summarize, and prepare the endless stream of correspondence that poured into the executive mansion. He would listen, question, and then make decisions rapidly, often in bursts that left staff scrambling to keep up on paper. Long technical documents bored him. He wanted key points, not paragraphs. That preference fed into his use of an informal kitchen cabinet, advisors who could walk in, talk through issues, and bypass some of the more elaborate written channels that earlier presidents had leaned on. To admirers, this felt refreshingly direct and democratic, a president who spoke plainly and cut through red tape. To critics, it looked like impatience with process, an executive who sidelined careful administrative routines in favor of personal will. Either way, the daily reality inside his presidency was clear. Decisions often began and ended with conversation, while paperwork lagged behind, trying to catch up to the speed of his instincts. 80. Van Buren's social networking by breakfast. Martin Van Buren understood politics as a web of relationships, favors, and understandings that had to be tended every single day. His mornings often doubled as quiet networking sessions disguised as ordinary meals or casual visits. A breakfast table that might look, from the outside, like genteel socializing was in practice a working forum where senators, representatives, and local power brokers drifted in and out. Van Buren listened more than he lectured, collecting scraps of information, testing loyalties, and gently steering conversations toward the alignments he wanted. He had helped build one of the first truly organized party machines in New York, and he brought that same methodical attention to social detail into the presidency. Rather than reserve political maneuvering for formal meetings, he wove it into routine hospitality. Coffee poured alongside quiet discussions of appointments, legislation, and state-level disputes. These breakfasts weren't dramatic showdowns. They were incremental nudges, the kind of soft pressure and reassurance that kept alliances from fraying. Later historians would label him the little magician for his behind-the-scenes skill, but that magic rested on hundreds of mornings where he turned small talk into subtle negotiation. To him, the early hours weren't downtime. They were where the day's political weather was carefully, almost invisibly, set. 81. Tyler's expanding household noise. John Tyler's presidency unfolded inside a home that sounded very different from the relatively quiet residences of some of his predecessors. He entered the office already a father many times over, and would go on to have more children while in public life, creating a constantly expanding family orbit that surrounded his daily routine. The White House, often imagined as a marble-lined seat of solemnity, became for him a living space crowded with children's voices, visiting relatives, and the everyday logistics of managing a large 19th century household. Domestic arrangements, schooling, meals, and health worries all intersected with official duties in ways that blurred any neat boundary between home and office. Staff and visitors had to navigate not just formal receptions but the reality of a bustling family environment where a president might move from policy discussions to parental conversations without ever leaving the building. This background noise shaped the rhythm of his days, inserting interruptions that were personal rather than political, and grounding the abstract business of state in the constant presence of family life. Supporters could point to this as evidence of ordinary humanity in high office, a reminder that the president was also a father surrounded by the same clamor as many households. Critics then and now might argue that such entanglement complicated an already fragile administration. But within those walls, the soundscape of Tyler's presidency was unmistakable. Less cloistered austerity, more crowded parlor. 82. Pierce's horseback relief. Franklin Pierce carried a weight of personal grief and political strain that never really left him, and his daily habits reflected a search for escape. One of his most consistent refuges was the saddle. Riding offered something the presidency rarely did: motion without argument, distance without debate. When he mounted a horse and left the immediate swirl of advisors and visitors, he entered a space where the rhythm of hooves and the demands of handling an animal pushed other thoughts to the edges. Contemporaries noted that he used these rides as a regular outlet, not just an occasional leisure outing. Routes became familiar. The act of leaving the formal spaces of Washington for open roads or quieter paths created a pattern, a reliable pressure valve. In an era before modern therapy or openly discussed mental health practices for public figures, such physical routines often carried emotional burdens silently. Pierce's riding habit can be seen as part exercise, part performance of a gentleman president at ease outdoors, and part private coping mechanism for a man whose tenure was marked by sectional conflict and personal sorrow. Whatever mixture of motives lay behind it, the effect on his days was tangible, There were times when the most important appointment on his informal schedule was not a meeting but a stretch of hours spent with only a horse, the landscape, and his own unspoken thoughts for company. 83. Buchanan's companion household pattern. James Buchanan entered the presidency with an unusual domestic arrangement for a bachelor chief executive. Without a wife to serve as the traditional hostess and household manager, he relied heavily on a close female relative, his niece Harriet Lane, to structure the social and domestic life of the White House. This created a daily pattern in which official duties and family support overlapped almost seamlessly. Buchanan's habit was to anchor himself in the more formal business of the day: correspondence, cabinet consultations, careful legalistic reading of documents, while much of the hosting, entertaining, and social diplomacy that kept Washington's elite network functioning flowed through Harriet's hands. Meals, receptions, and visits were not just pleasantries. They were an extension of governance, shaping impressions of the administration and smoothing or straining relationships with influential figures. Inside the residence, staff and relatives formed a small ecosystem that buffered Buchanan from some of the more mundane decisions about household management, allowing him to retreat into a routine that could be almost monastic in its focus on papers and policy. Yet that very retreat made the companion household even more central. The warmth, charm, and accessibility associated with his presidency in social terms often came less from Buchanan's own daily interactions and more from the family members who shared the house. His working day, in practice, rested on a quiet division of labor, public authority in his office, domestic and social navigation in the hands of trusted kin. 84. Lincoln's pocket memoranda. Abraham Lincoln moved through his days with a mind that rarely stopped turning, even when the moments around him looked ordinary. One of his most characteristic habits was deceptively simple. He wrote things down on scraps of paper and tucked them into his pockets. Ideas, fragments of speeches, legal phrases, statistics, jokes, half-formed arguments, anything that seemed worth saving might be captured quickly before it dissolved into the constant noise of war and politics. These little notes accumulated in his coat like a portable filing system, unorganized in appearance but meaningful to him. When he found a quieter interval late at night, in the relative calm of his office, or during pauses between meetings, he would pull them out, review, expand, or discard, turning scattered impressions into more coherent thoughts. Some of his most famous lines began as rough phrases on such scraps. The habit suited a president whose formal education had been limited and largely self-directed. Writing and revisiting notes was a way of thinking in public and private at once. It also matched his storytelling nature. A remark heard in a corridor or a statistic mentioned in passing could later re-emerge, refined, in a speech or conversation. The daily cycle of jotting and pocketing, then re-examining, gave structure to a mind forced to balance battlefield reports with questions of law, morality, and national identity. In the middle of a fractured country, his pockets quietly filled with the raw materials of how he would try to hold it together. 85. Garfield's language practice. James A. Garfield's daily life contained a kind of intellectual calisthenics that most people would struggle to keep up with. Long before he reached the White House, he had cultivated the habit of treating languages and classical texts as everyday companions, rather than rarefied academic exercises. As president, that pattern didn't disappear. It just had to be squeezed between appointments, visitors, and the bureaucratic grind. He was known to move between English, Latin, and Greek with ease, sometimes translating lines back and forth as a way of keeping his mind sharp. This wasn't just a party trick. For Garfield, it was a form of mental hygiene, a way to clear the fog left by political arguments and administrative details. A brief interval with a classical author or a puzzle in grammar and syntax could reset his concentration before the next meeting. In quieter stretches, he might revisit familiar passages from ancient historians or philosophers, tracing parallels or contrasts with the American experiment he was trying to steer. In an age when many politicians invoked classical references for show, Garfield's engagement was a genuine daily practice rooted in years of disciplined study. His desk might be piled with modern reports and letters, but somewhere nearby there was often a well-thumbed volume in a foreign tongue, ready to serve as a reminder that his world, however intense, was part of a much longer conversation stretching back centuries. 86. Harrison's grandfather clock regularity. Benjamin Harrison's White House felt, to many who worked there, like it was run on gears only slightly softer than a barracks. He brought with him a reputation for formality and a lawyer's respect for structure, and that translated into a household rhythm where punctuality was not just preferred but expected. The sound of clocks, especially the big steady presence of a grandfather clock, became a kind of metronome for his days. Meals began at set times. Meetings were scheduled with little tolerance for drift, and the small domestic rituals of the house fell into step with that discipline. Staff quickly understood that lateness was noticed and that fashionably delayed entrances, common in looser social circles, did not earn favor here. Harrison's own movements often reflected the same precise sense of timing: morning devotions, review of correspondence, office hours, and family time tended to follow predictable patterns. To some visitors, the atmosphere felt stiff, even chilly, as if the household had been organized according to a docket rather than the easy ebb and flow of lived-in space. But for Harrison, who had commanded troops in war and argued cases in court, the reliable ticking of time was a comfort, a way to impose order on a role that could otherwise dissolve into constant interruptions. The clocks in his environment weren't just decoration. They were silent partners in his belief that both government and home operated best when everyone knew exactly what hour it was and what ought to be happening. 87. Theodore Roosevelt's family and politics blur. Theodore Roosevelt lived like someone who had been given too much energy for a single job and refused to waste any of it. His domestic life and his public role bled into each other so constantly that it could be hard to say where one ended and the other began. The White House under Roosevelt was not a hushed, ceremonial mansion. It was a noisy, bustling home full of children, pets, visitors, and the relentless motion of a man who believed in living vigorously. Official papers might share table space with children's toys. A conversation about foreign policy could be interrupted by a family request or some commotion in another room, only for Roosevelt to dive back into high strategy without missing a beat. He relished that chaos, seeing no contradiction between being a father, a reformer, a naturalist, and a commander-in-chief at the same time. Staff and guests quickly learned that serious discussions could happen on walks, during meals, or in brief snatches between family interactions. To Roosevelt, this blend wasn't careless. It was efficient and honest. Life came as a whole, not in neat administrative files. His children grew up in a space where cabinet members, foreign dignitaries, and family friends all moved through the same corridors, where the presidency was simply part of the background of daily life. The result was a kind of open frontier inside the executive mansion, a place where the rough and tumble of family could coexist with the weight of decisions that reshaped the country. 88. Taft's afternoon automobile escapes. William Howard Taft occupied a presidency that often felt, to him, like a suit cut in the wrong style, constricting, formal, and tailored to expectations he didn't entirely share. One of his quiet rebellions against that pressure came in the form of afternoon automobile drives. At a time when cars were still novel and a bit glamorous, Taft used them less as displays and more as a release valve. Climbing into a vehicle and moving through the streets or out toward the countryside offered a sensation he struggled to find inside the ceremonial rooms of the White House: movement without obligation. For an hour or two, the world narrowed to the road ahead, the mechanical hum and the changing scenery. The constant flow of questions, petitions, and political maneuvering faded into the background. These drives weren't wild escapades. They were measured, scheduled breaks, but they carried for Taft a psychological freedom that the calendar of banquets and conferences did not. Observers sometimes focused on his physical size, making jokes that reduced him to a caricature, but behind those jabs was a man who understood he needed space, literally and figuratively, to think and breathe. The afternoon automobile routine gave him that space. Behind the windshield, away from the dense atmosphere of Washington expectations, he could momentarily reassume the quieter identity of a thoughtful jurist and private citizen, even while the responsibilities of the presidency followed at a respectful distance. 89. Wilson's reading aloud at home. Woodrow Wilson's public image leaned heavily on the notion of him as a scholar in politics, a man of ideas set loose in government. That scholarly habit didn't stay confined to speeches and policy memos. It seeped into his domestic routines as well. At home, he sometimes turned private reading into a shared ritual, gathering family or trusted companions and reading passages aloud. The material ranged from literature to history to political theory, but the act itself followed a recognizable pattern: text, commentary, reflection. For Wilson, the spoken word seemed to carry a clarifying power that silent reading did not. Hearing the sentences, pausing to underline a phrase, or drawing out a parallel between some past event and his current dilemmas let him process information in a more embodied way. The family audience, whether they were deeply engaged or merely polite listeners, gave him an informal forum to test how ideas sounded outside his own head. These sessions blurred the boundary between intellectual life and family life, turning living rooms into small, unrecorded lecture halls. They also reveal how tightly woven his identity as a thinker was with his role as a husband and father. Leisure time, in his world, often meant not escape from ideas, but a different setting for them. In the quiet of the house, the president who argued for world order and democratic principles became simply a man with a book, reading words that helped him make sense of both his era and his place in it. 90. Coolidge's silent breakfast atmosphere. Calvin Coolidge's reputation for reticence wasn't just a political caricature, it was something the people around him felt at the table every morning. Breakfast in the Coolidge household could be a remarkably quiet affair, more ritual than social event. Plates, cups, and the routine of the meal provided the structure, but conversation often did not rush in to fill the gaps. Coolidge himself seemed comfortable with that stillness, treating the early hours less as a time for chatter and more as a necessary pause before the demands of the day. Visitors unfamiliar with his habits sometimes mistook the silence for coldness or disapproval, not realizing that, for him, economy of words was simply the default setting. This subdued atmosphere shaped the tone of his mornings, deliberate, unhurried, and insulated from the noise of politics waiting just beyond the door. In its own way, the silent breakfast functioned like a meditative practice. While others might seek calm through explicit reflection or prayer, Coolidge chose not to fill the air at all. The discipline of saying little extended from private life into his governing style. Short statements, careful speeches, an instinct to do more by refraining than by constantly announcing. In an office that often rewards dramatic proclamations, his breakfast table was a small island of intentional quiet, where the day's first decisions were made without a single wasted word. 91. Hoover's Quaker-inspired reserve. Herbert Hoover carried a kind of built-in quiet with him, the residue of a childhood shaped by Quaker discipline and understatement. In a White House where some presidents filled rooms by sheer volume and gesturing, Hoover tended to subtract himself from noise rather than compete with it. His days often unfolded in a pattern that looked from the outside like a series of controlled enclosures, tightly scheduled meetings, careful reviews of reports, and long stretches in which he spoke little and listened a great deal. The Quaker emphasis on plainness seeped into that routine. Flashy displays, theatrical anger, even overt self-pity in the face of mounting crisis, he had little patience for any of it. Staff members who expected pep talks or emotional outbursts discovered instead a president who regarded restraint as a kind of duty. That didn't mean he lacked intensity. It meant the intensity tended to run inward, through meticulous note-taking, private calculations, and a preference for written communication over spontaneous performance. This reserve created a daily rhythm quieter than what modern observers imagine when they picture the presidency. In the middle of economic catastrophe and rising desperation, the man at the desk still kept to an almost austere working style, as if the best answer to chaos was to become smaller, more composed, more tightly wound. To many Americans, that composure read as coldness. Inside the mansion, it was simply the familiar cadence of a life trained to treat silence as both shield and habit. 92. FDR's bed-based morning briefings. Franklin Roosevelt's public image is all podiums and fireside chats, the confident voice cutting through the static of national anxiety. But many of his workdays began in a setting that looked far less grand, propped up in bed, surrounded by papers, before the formality of the office ever came into play. Physical disability shaped that pattern, but so did preference. The bed became an early morning command center, a place where he could review overnight cables, skim reports, and talk through issues with a small circle of aides while still in a robe. This was not laziness. It was a deliberate staging of his energy. By the time he rolled into more public spaces, much of the mental sorting had already been done, quietly, in those first hours. The atmosphere of these sessions could be oddly intimate, a mix of serious policy, stray jokes, and the informal shorthand that develops among people who see one another far too often. Aides might be perched on chairs or standing with notebooks while the president read, commented, redirected, and occasionally set entire lines of inquiry in motion before he'd even fully dressed. The bed blurred the line between private vulnerability and institutional power. From that horizontal position, FDR could hide the labor involved in movement, conserve strength, and still process the flow of a world war and a collapsing economy. By the time the day formally started downstairs, a quieter, unseen version of the presidency had already been at work for hours, shaping decisions before the rest of the building caught up. 93. Truman's handwritten daily marginalia. Harry Truman never fully abandoned the habits of a man who expected his opinions to be recorded on paper rather than performed for television. His presidency unfolded at the hinge between those eras, but his instinctive response to most documents remained resolutely analog. He wrote on them. Reports, memos, briefing papers, the margins of his working day gradually filled with the quick, blunt handwriting of someone who didn't see much point in polishing first reactions into polite abstractions. Nonsense. No, this is correct, and more colorful assessments appeared in the white spaces next to formal bureaucratic prose. These scribbles gave him a way to argue back immediately without convening a meeting or dictating a letter. They also left a trail of unfiltered thought that later historians would comb through for glimpses of his mind at work. To staff, this marginalia was both guidance and warning. A sharply worded note could kill a proposal before it ever reached the cabinet room. A brief go-ahead in the corner might accelerate a plan that had been languishing in subcommittees. The habit turned reading into a daily dialogue, each page a quiet conversation between the institutional voice of the government and the private voice of the man temporarily steering it. In an age before email chains and instant messaging, Truman's annotations functioned like a continuous handwritten commentary track on his own administration. The feeling that he was present in the paperwork, sometimes amused, sometimes irritated, sometimes decisive, was not an accident. It was the product of a pencil moving across margins while the rest of Washington kept talking. 94. Eisenhower's time-blocked management system. Dwight Eisenhower arrived at the presidency after a lifetime of organizing massive, complex operations where confusion could literally cost lives. He carried that operational mindset straight into his daily schedule. Instead of letting the office turn into an endless stream of random interruptions, he and his staff carved the day into distinct categories: urgent decisions, routine approvals, long-term planning, ceremonial duties, and private reflection. Each block had its own place on the calendar, and intruders had to earn their way in. One of his quiet obsessions was separating what needed the president specifically from what merely wanted his attention. That distinction shaped when he was accessible, what he read personally, and how often he allowed his time to be fragmented. He would push lower priority matters into tightly contained windows, forcing issues to compete with one another within the same slot instead of sprawling across the whole day. This structure didn't eliminate chaos. No schedule can do that in the White House. But it gave Eisenhower a framework for pushing back. The rhythm of his days, a predictable alternation between decision-heavy meetings, strategic thinking periods, and strictly limited social obligations, helped him resist becoming a permanent firefighter. Decades later, productivity writers would turn his approach into diagrams and matrices, identifying quadrants of urgent and important, or neither. For Eisenhower, it wasn't a self-help theory. It was a survival technique. In the midst of nuclear brinkmanship and domestic pressures, his time-blocked routine functioned like a shield, preserving just enough space for a general-turned-president to think before everyone else demanded that he simply react. 95. Kennedy's back brace concealment routine. John F. Kennedy's public presence projected youth, ease, and a kind of athletic glamour, but his body did not share that narrative. Chronic back pain and long-standing injuries meant that getting dressed in the morning was not a trivial act. It was a small operation, repeated daily, designed to hide weakness while allowing him to function. The back brace, stiff, constricting, medically necessary, became a quiet partner in everything he did. Staff and family saw the ritual of strapping in, adjusting clothing over the apparatus, checking in mirrors and with trusted eyes to be sure nothing showed. The goal was simple: move through the days of meetings, ceremonies, and cameras without broadcasting the effort each step required. This concealment shaped choices large and small. Standing engagements were calibrated to what his spine could tolerate. Seating arrangements, motorcade timing, even the length of handshaking lines took on an invisible medical dimension. Yet most observers saw only the polished surface, the easy grin, the relaxed posture, the impression of unforced vitality. The brace helped hold that illusion together, at a cost measured in discomfort and constraint. It limited motion even as it enabled it, creating a paradox where the president's apparent freedom of movement depended on being partially bound. In the quiet spaces before and after public events, adjusting straps, stretching carefully, or grimacing at a sudden flare of pain, Kennedy lived with a bodily reality that the official photographs almost never acknowledged. His daily routine was in part an ongoing negotiation between image and spine, with steel and fabric mediating between the two. 96. Johnson's face-to-face pressure technique. Lyndon Johnson treated distance as the enemy of persuasion. To change minds, he preferred to close the gap, literally. His working days in the White House often featured a choreography of proximity that aides came to recognize as a distinct technique. He would draw senators, representatives, staffers, and visitors into his personal orbit, sometimes so close that retreat felt socially awkward. A hand on the shoulder, a looming posture, a voice pitched just low enough that leaning in became necessary. These were not accidents. They were habits refined over decades in legislative backrooms and cloakrooms, repurposed for the Oval Office. Johnson liked to talk in long, looping monologues that folded flattery, threat, anecdote, and data into a single pressure wave aimed squarely at the person in front of him. The Johnson treatment, as it came to be called, wasn't reserved for grand occasions. It appeared in quarter conversations, impromptu office visits, and late-night phone calls that followed up on earlier in-person sessions. His daily environment adjusted around this preference. Chairs and sofas could become staging grounds for cornering someone. Walking meetings might detour into quieter spaces where voices could lower and the physical distance tighten. Some found the method bullying, others strangely compelling, but almost no one walked away feeling neutral. Johnson's reliance on close physical persuasion turned the presidential day into a series of intensely personal encounters, each one calibrated to wear down resistance, not with formal arguments from a podium, but with the unrelenting presence of a man who believed that politics, at its core, still hinged on what happened when two people stood a foot apart and one of them refused to back away. 97. Reagan's card notes and quips. Ronald Reagan built a public image on ease, timing, and the impression that the right words just arrived when he needed them. Behind that surface was a quieter, almost studious habit, stacks of note cards filled with lines, jokes, quotes, and fragments he'd been collecting for decades. Long before the presidency, he kept files of one-liners, historical references, and stories, revisiting them the way some people flip through family photo albums. In the White House, those cards became part of his daily rhythm. Mornings or downtime between meetings might include a few minutes of review, not to memorize in the rigid sense, but to refresh the mental catalog. He practiced delivery, adjusted wording, and tested how a line sounded out loud. Staff saw him flip through cards before big addresses, but he did the same before seemingly casual toasts or small gatherings. That preparation gave him the ability to sound spontaneous while actually drawing from a carefully curated mental library. The relaxed charm so many Americans saw on television was, in part, the byproduct of a man quietly rehearsing his own voice, line by line, on small rectangles of paper no camera ever bothered to film. 98. Clinton's conversation-heavy scheduling. Bill Clinton's days often refused to stay within the lines the scheduling office drew for them. On paper, his calendar could look almost militarily precise. 15 minutes here, 20 there, a tightly packed procession of meetings, briefings, and appearances. In practice, time bent toward his appetite for conversation. He lingered. A 10-minute handshake line might stretch into half an hour because he stopped to ask questions and actually listened to the answers. A routine briefing could become an impromptu seminar as he quizzed staff, pulled in additional voices, and chased side paths that interested him. Governors, activists, professors, and ordinary visitors discovered the same pattern. He wanted more detail, more stories, more data, more context. Inside the West Wing, this habit made him notorious among schedulers and beloved by many of the people he engaged. It also meant that aides learned to build buffers around him, knowing an informal chat could easily become a dense, hour-long exchange. Clinton's daily life as president was saturated with these extended encounters, a rolling conversational workshop where policy, gossip, and personal biography all mixed. The cost was constant schedule slippage. The benefit, at least for him, was a steady flow of information and human texture that no written memo could match. To sit across from him, even briefly, was to be pulled into that conversational gravity, and the clock often didn't survive intact. 99. Obama's family dinner protection. Barack Obama walked into the modern presidency with an awareness that the office can devour every waking hour if allowed to. One of his quiet strategies to resist that pull was deceptively simple: protect family dinner. On many evenings, regardless of what the calendar looked like, he aimed to step away from the West Wing and join his wife and daughters at the table upstairs. The food itself wasn't the point. It was the boundary. For that stretch of time, conversation drifted toward school, books, pop culture, and the small details that make up a family's private universe. Phones, crises, and political storms waited on the other side of the meal. Staff learned to route non-emergency matters around that window whenever possible, building the president's schedule around an invisible line labeled, essentially, home. It wasn't always achievable. International calls, emergencies, and late votes sometimes shattered the intention, but the habit remained a North Star in his daily planning. The dinner ritual offered a mental reset, a reminder that his identity extended beyond briefings and motorcades. In a job that constantly invited him to live entirely in abstractions and headlines, the clink of dishes and the chatter of teenagers became a grounding soundscape. Protecting that hour was not just sentiment, it was strategy. 100. Biden's rosary and reflection habit. Joe Biden carries much of his private history in small portable rituals, and one of the most consistent is his rosary. The beads he often mentions are not merely religious objects. They are tethers to memory, loss, and a sense of continuity that predates any office he's held. In daily life, that can look like brief, quiet intervals carved out of the schedule, a few minutes before a meeting, a pause in a motorcade, time alone in the residence where prayer and reflection compress the noise of the day into something manageable. He has spoken openly about drawing on faith during moments of grief and decision, and that habit followed him into the presidency. For staff, it registers less as a dramatic scene and more as a recurring low-profile pattern, the president stepping aside, head slightly bowed, hands occupied with something no camera needs to see up close. These moments don't stop the machinery of government, but they insert an element of stillness into its rotation. In a role defined by relentless outward demands, statements, signatures, responses, the rosary and the internal dialogue that comes with it operate in the opposite direction, turning him inward for a time. The habit doesn't resolve the weight of the decisions waiting outside the door. It simply gives him a familiar way to stand under that weight without feeling entirely alone.